Climate Takes, Carbon13's podcast, where we ask our special guests for their takes on their industry, climate challenge, and also ask what is it going to take to fight the climate emergency. Today is a very special episode because we are looking at the world of corporate VCs. CVCs are significant investors into startups. In fact, in 2024, it's estimated they invested at least $10 billion into climate startups alone. And therefore, it's really important that founders and angels are understanding how CVCs work, what they're looking for, and how this industry is changing as it has quite an interesting future over the next few years. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Smeed, who works for the CVC of Jaguar Land Rover InMotion Ventures, which specialises in pre-seed and climate. More on that later.
Route to net zero is a multi-billion trillion dollar problem, and actually it's the incumbents that have got the cash to really be part of the solution. What I would say to angels is that we know how difficult it is when you're advising a startup company about how to engage corporates. We talk to over 2,500 startups every year, like any VC would say, but really the value that we add and the reason that we exist is making the connections to the parent. One of the things I'm most proud about is that 90% of our active portfolio today, which has 22 companies in it, are working with JLR in some way.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to hear what you've got to say about CVCs.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Okay, easy question. What is a CVC?
We'll start off with $1 million question. So, corporate venture capital is an investment vehicle set up by a corporate rather than a series or rather than a GP LP relationship that VCs have, but specifically set up as an investment vehicle for a corporate for a specific reason. Now, that reason could be to explore new technologies or new business models that could be opportunities or threats that the corporate sees on the far horizon beyond its existing planning cycles. And how I would start that question, or answering that question really would be that there's a lot of similarities between VCs and CVCs. Now, typically, a CVC would have one LP, whereas a VC would tend to have a number. However, that's changing, and we'll talk a little bit, hopefully, in a moment about how CVC is definitely changing in the landscape. But typically, they're set up for a specific reason. And that reason could be all the way from very strategic in terms of looking at those threats and opportunities that I've described, right the way through to, on the other end of the scale, a very financially focused CVC, which is looking to make money out of its investments as its sole focus. However, in reality, those two extremes are incredibly rare. And in 2.5 years of being in a CVC, I think I've met a couple at either end versus the hundreds that exist in the middle of that spectrum. And typically what we find is that a CVC is set up to explore those strategic themes of the parent company, but also has as almost an entry into that a financial focus to make sure that it's not losing money, because there's not, it's not very strategic to lose money left, right, and center. So you have to make sure that you are, at least as an entry, making sure that those investments will at least wash their face, even in the end when you're a more strategically focused CVC.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think let's dive in a minute further into why a corporate would choose to do a CVC over R&D or over just being a customer in a minute. I think you alluded to something there. Would you just give us your take on CVC in 2025 and how it's changed over the last few years?
Yeah, so I've been leading the managing director of InMotion Ventures now for 2.5 years. And I've seen a lot of change just in that 2.5 years alone. But when I was researching and doing my homework before accepting this role within the company, CVC's gone through huge amounts of change over the past 5 to 10 years, particularly in the US. And I think ourselves in Europe are a little bit behind on that journey. When I first started looking at CVCs, maybe the the history of CVCs kind of 5 to 10 years ago was very much focused on being an extension of business development. So traditionally, very close to the corporate, was very slow in its decision making, was kind of focused on safe bets. And really what we've seen over the past few years, and again, our US colleagues are much further advanced than this, really starting to take on some of those VC principles, really focusing on making sure that the corporate venture capital arm is acting really quite independently from the parent. So there is that clear line between the two. So we are InMotion Ventures. We're not JLR Ventures for a reason. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of JLR. So we have our own board. We have our own mandate from the parent company to enable us to invest in our thesis as our sole LP. And really what we've been focusing on, and a lot of my peers have been focusing on, is building credibility within the VC ecosystem, and whether that's amongst VCs, but also amongst startups as well, to make sure that people see us as that really, as a really solid and credible player within the ecosystem, so that we can bring what we believe are our unique selling points as an investor with the backing of our corporate parent, to make sure that we can add value to the investments that we make. And I know that traditionally a lot of people listening to this, whether they're startups or angels, will raise their eyebrows when anyone talks about adding value to startups. But we firmly believe that as part of a corporate entity, we have the opportunity to add value in a way that I believe is unique to our VC colleagues.
You mentioned the word unique. I've heard you speak in the past about, I think one of the issues with approaching CVCs is they're all incredibly different to each other. I think there's even more difference than between a set of VCs often in what they're trying to achieve, how they work, who's working there, the culture, etc. What is your thesis at InMotion Ventures then?
Yes, I think you raise a great point, and it goes back to why corporates set up CVC units in the first place. And there is a really broad spectrum. As I mentioned, we've got the kind of financial versus strategic, which I think is a little bit of an outdated concept now, given that it's a bit of both, and the most there. So really the why the CVC exists will be wholly dependent on the parent company and the way in which the parent company operates. So I talk to my peers in other CVCs, whether it's in the US or Europe or in Asia, and some of the things that I would say to them would make them shiver in terms of the way of working in their corporate. And likewise, the way that they work, I just sit there and think that would never work in our environment. However, I think what does really bring us together is the real clear thesis on why we're investing. And what that allows us to do, almost as a reverse pitch, is to make it clear to startups or to fellow investors, what is it that InMotion Ventures or another CVC can bring to their cap table? What is it that is their unique selling point in terms of what they can do? We know that there are, like we see in VCs at the moment, VCs specialize, whether it's in different stages of a company's development, whether it's in the different kind of services that they add, whether it's portfolio or being a board member or all of those things, because we're acutely aware that everyone's money is the same. So therefore, what we bring and how we persuade startups to take our money is a really important part of our thesis. So if I go into our thesis specifically, so we're an early stage investor. So we look to invest at seed to Series A is our sweet spot. However, we have invested at pre-seed, and with sufficient pull from the business, we've also had the flexibility to invest up to Series B as well. But those are in the more unique or special cases, shall we say. And we focus on three core technologies: so climate, industrial, and enterprise technologies. So you won't be surprised, climate, which is the reason that we're having this conversation. But that really is to support technologies that will enable and also speed up JLR's commitment to be net zero by 2039. So that's really focusing on the electrification of our vehicles all the way through from kind of pack production all the way through to second life and the recycling of those batteries, industrial decarbonisation of our plants and facilities, and advanced materials. So looking there at low carbon or carbon negative materials, but also the circularity of those materials. And then I suppose what's less interesting maybe for your listeners will be industrial tech. So looking at advanced manufacturing and technologies for companies that make things. And then enterprise, which is really focusing on software for enterprises. So looking at things like cybersecurity, data management, cloud management, and things like that. And then underpinned by, kind of what we call deep tech, which again is something that I think is really overused and really misunderstood. But for us, it means really complicated things. They're going to take a while to kind of come to fruition. And that's really focusing on things like sensors, semiconductors, space technologies, where we see an adjacency between space and looking at the OEM and the car world, as well as looking at things like AI and novel compute. So it's quite a broad thesis. And what that really signifies is the fact that JLR's strategy is one that goes beyond the vehicle. This isn't just a product strategy that JLR has. When we look at the strategic transformation of the company, it goes beyond that. It goes into the type of company that JLR wishes to be, the type of enterprise that it wants to be, as well as the commitments that it's made from a sustainability perspective as well.
You wouldn't necessarily think, JLR, okay, space. But we're asking founders to come to you who've got vision and are on a mission. And so, they're really looking, you've already set a timeline of 2039, actually. And so founders should be, okay, how does my company potentially at scale support that vision in that time frame, right? That's 15 years from here, more or less. What's one of your, you're probably not allowed favorites, but what's a company you've invested in that that comes to mind?
Oh, it's like picking between one of my children, isn't it? So I'll take a cop out. Let me talk about our most recent investments. So we recently invested in a company called Cyclic Materials, which is based in Canada. And they are looking at the recycling of rare earth elements and metals that are used in the production of electronic magnets. So they're used in wind turbines and they're used in the motors that power electronic vehicles. And currently, less than 1% of those materials are recycled in Europe. And those materials are contained in a lot of electronic waste. So whether that is computers, whether it's mobile phones, all the way through to batteries that are used in electric cars. So there's quite a large amount of raw material there. And actually, we invested alongside companies such as Microsoft, Amazon, BMW, and Hitachi, as well as ourselves in that investment more recently. And what's quite fascinating is, you talk about the way the world, kind of changes a lot. Obviously, this is being recorded at the end of February, and the discussions between Donald Trump and Zelensky around rare earth minerals in Ukraine is quite a large topic. And when we took this to our investment committee, before Christmas, it's a really interesting one. We were having to talk about rare earth materials and what they meant and where they were used in vehicles. And there were lots of materials that end in IUMs that you never really heard of before. So it was really interesting that, sometimes it'd be quite easy now to do that investment committee again, because it's something that's really well publicized.
The podcast episode, a couple of that I recorded a couple before this, is literally climatetech's critical materials, and was looking at the supply chains of rare earth minerals, for example, and the complexity of tracking those supply chains, let alone optimizing them, as you will know.
That's really important. If I could just on that one, because what it comes to is that when we look at climatech investing in particular, we're starting to build a bit of an ecosystem around that, even within our InMotion Ventures portfolio. So as well as cyclic materials in the rare earth elements used in magnets, if used in the recycling of those materials. We've also made investments in battery recycling technologies, as well as a company called Circular based in the UK that's looking at battery passports and the tracking of materials all the way through their lives. So from source all the way through to second life as well. So again, it's a really important thing, as you say. It's a very important, kind of topic, and which is getting quite a lot of focus at the moment. Maybe not from, and again, maybe we'll talk about this in a second, around the rebranding of climatetech from something that's, very much, focused on the environment to one that's now focused on things like national security. Even the way that Keir Starmer was talking, and they were talking about renewable energy in the UK, wind turbines, the noise and the way in which we're looking at solar and wind turbine energy generation in the UK, we're seeing that subtlety now of it moving away from being necessarily all about the environment and net zero into, how do we determine our energy security and how do we reduce our reliance on natural gas? The outcome is exactly the same. The way that it's talked about and everything else, I think, we're seeing a bit of a change in that at the moment.
Yes, energy security, materials security, food security, say a word, stick security on it, and it is both true and often coincides with climate. On the podcast previous to this, it's on synthetic biology, and that is viewed as a potential replacement for a lot of things which are either dependent on fossil fuels or complicated supply chain. In this podcast, we want to talk about CVCs for angels and founders, and I think I'm going to start with angels first. What would you want startup angels to know about CVCs and your work?
So when I talk to angel investors, and we do through a lot of the work that we would do with being part of so we're based in London, so we talk to a lot of groups in London in particular, and we'll go to events and we'll talk about CVC because there is a perception change that we have to overcome amongst both angel investors and I think VC investors in the UK and Europe in particular. As I mentioned, I think our colleagues in the US are further ahead because I think they've got a better track record than we have. And what I would say to angels is that we know how difficult it is when you're advising a startup company about how to engage corporates. Quite often the traditional routes of getting into a corporate are many, but the shutters come down very quickly. And what I would encourage people to think about is that CVCs are a fantastic entry route into the corporate because you will get an incredibly quick no from a CVC, whether it's in or out of thesis, in a discussion with a member of our team that could probably take you 6 months to get to when you're being sent around the houses by various different groups, within a corporate, just because you can't find the right point of entry. And what I would also describe as well is that there's a lot of things that you might read about what corporates say, and I'll talk more generally now. I'm not talking about JLR, obviously, but when we look at kind of what a lot of corporates kind of talk about the areas that they're interested in, actually what we see is when you talk to a CVC, that's a sign of commitment when you do make an investment, because all of a sudden you're putting your money where your mouth is rather than talking about the things that you're interested in, talking about what you're going to do, in the future. So by really being clear on the CVC, and also, as I mentioned, and we talked about just now, there are many different reasons for a corporate having a CVC. So being able to talk to a member of the CVC investment team or the platform team is a really important way, and everyone's got their own websites, everyone's set up, in differently. So I'd really encourage, angels to be seeing the CVC as a really viable way and a relatively straightforward way into the parent, rather than you being sent around the houses, but also really clear about what are the types of things we do invest in and we don't, and what is our track record of the companies in our portfolio, and what have we delivered. One of the things I'm most proud about is that 90% of our active portfolio today, which has 22 companies in it, are working with JLR in some way. Now, that could be through a proof of concept. It could be all the way through to a direct commercial relationship where they're a supplier or a customer to JLR. But that's something that we've worked on incredibly hard over the past 2 years to really focus on what we're doing with our portfolio companies, because we're ready. We're an early stage investor. This is a long-term commitment that both ourselves and the startups and fellow investors are making. So therefore, we want to make sure that we have the ability to deliver on those promises and those discussions that we have, when we make an investment.
So, for any angel working with a startup, the very general advice is it can be a good way to really map out that organization or understand that, or, do market research. But again, it's just this message. Every CVC is very unique, and you need to understand why it's come to be and its track record.
Completely, because what you will want and what an angel will want, whether it's either, so two things, either thinking about future fundraising and the way in which your cap table is being kind of made up, but also from the other side is, helping them in terms of business development, because typically, one of the large or areas that I see angels, adding the most value to startup companies is being able to make those connections. And again, it's very difficult to get into, very large corporates such as JLR. And actually, that's the reason we exist. So we talk to over 2,500 startups every year, like any VC would say. But really, the value that we add and the reason that we exist is making the connections to the parent. Now, not all of those connections will end up with an investment. Some of those could end up in, we have a venture clienting arm within JLR, for example. So there are lots of ways in which we've actually introduced startups that we don't think quite meet our investment criteria, but we do see a need within the business. And therefore, that could trigger into a relationship with JLR, not necessarily having an investment. So I'd really encourage people to see the CVC as potentially a quicker and slightly easier route to a no, because that's what a lot of founders tell us is, please, the worst thing, for any startup is just having, the perpetual, kind of being blanked or ghosted by someone, when actually the answer is no.
Yeah, come back with more traction. We love what you're doing. We just need to see this.
Completely, it just makes everyone's heart sink. But really, I think getting clear on that, and that's what my team, Louis on climate, and together with Sam, who looks after our industrial and enterprise, kind of verticals. That's what they spend their time really doing, and making sure we're hopefully really clear on our website, and we have a way of startups getting in contact with us, which we do actively look at on a regular basis to make sure that we're filtering that through and we're getting back to people. But we're just making sure there that that we can avoid that that just perpetual kind of loop of doom where it's just silence that comes back.
You briefly mentioned venture clienting. I'll just say that's where a corporate is looking to be a customer of a startup, but in a weird way, similar to almost if they were being an investor. So it's a really, really early stage startup. So they are sort of working with them from very early stage to try and develop their product to a place where they could be a normal customer, as I understand it.
Yes. So it takes many forms, but yeah. So how I would describe the difference between venture clienting and venture investing is venture clienting is typically based on a problem statement from the company. So within JLR, there are a large number of people working in that area that are focused on using startups, because we know that true innovation's happening within startups. It's not happening necessarily in large corporates, and therefore having access to the startup ecosystem is really important to generate innovation within a company. Now, again, as I kind of described, having a startup working with a big corporate tends to be very difficult. And therefore, venture clienting is a great way based on a problem statement approach. So a member of the team will say, I've looked at my incumbent supply base, I've looked at our ability internally, and I would really like to do X. But at the moment, I don't see a technology being able to to be able to address that. So the venture clienting process will then run that through a scouting process using InMotion Ventures platform data, as well as our corporate partner Plug and Play, and that will enable us to scout very quickly amongst the thousands of startups globally, to focus in on who do we think the startups are that are providing that that technology, and it's a very managed process, whereby those are then filtered down into a pitch. Those pitch can then move into a proof of concept, and then those proof of concepts could then be moved into a commercial relationship kind of after that point. So it's a very managed process that makes sure that these things survive through the process, and that the corporate machine, if you will, doesn't kind of have an allergic reaction to a startup company kind of coming in a world in which typically large corporations like to work with large suppliers, because there's a mutual understanding there of kind of how things work. And that's a very successful way of JLR being able to work with those startups and bring those technologies. Now, the difference there is that that's typically based on an identified problem. The way that we work within venture capital, CVC is very similar to venture capital, that we're focused on themes rather than specific problem statements. And also our value comes in bringing technologies into the business that maybe they haven't thought about yet. And a great example of that was an investment we made in a semiconductor open source design company called Chipflow. Now, when we first met them about 6 to 9 months ago, this was an area that JLR wasn't thinking about for 2 or 3 years away. But actually, on the back of our investment and the introductions that we were able to make, they managed to fast forward a lot of their thinking. And in actual fact, a proof of concept was born in a module that they designed, which was delivered in months versus years, and much significantly cheaper than the millions it normally takes to design a semiconductor chip. And therefore that, and the next step for us is now to move that into kind of production. So that's how I would describe the main difference between a venture clienting approach and then venture investing. But it's all part of a suite of approaches to what we call within the company open innovation.
I would say out of about 76 Carbon13 investments, 74 to 75 are B2B. And our founders are literally waking up every morning, how can I work with a corporate? Because that's what I need. You mentioned you're talking to 2,500 startups or however many every year. What does a good relationship building strategy look like with a CVC? What are you hoping to see from founders? When should they start to get in touch with you? What kind of style of communication? How often? What updates? What's good relationship building look like?
I think that's a great question, and I think we are a seed to Series A investor typically, as I kind of mentioned. So we are looking for those early stage technologies that are going to take a while to develop. So again, I know everyone uses the term patient capital, but that's a really important point for us. And actually, we've realized that in quite a way that's maybe a bit different to how people would think, we actually find it easier to bring in a much earlier stage startup company into the parent than we do a later stage company. And typically that's because that later stage company might be, bumping into established relationships between the parent and a large supplier. Now, so that's an area that, now what that brings with it is obviously us developing relationships with startups in that really early stage. Now, sometimes we are going to hit people with the, it's a bit too early for us and we need to, kind of see how it kind of develops. But the really big thing that we're looking for, and where, if I look at the investments that we've made in these spaces, it's one, is the solution that the startup is designing or developing or wants to develop addressing a real core problem. Now we're seeing a lot of, everything's AI nowadays, everything's quantum, everything's all of these things, and they're really neat solutions, but has the problem been properly defined yet? And that's a really big thing for us, particularly as an OEM in a heavily regulated industry. We need to be sure, particularly in the climate space, that it is addressing tangibly the route to carbon net zero by 2039. So sometimes when we look at, and I'll give you an example. So if we look at biofuels is a great example of that. I can see there's a really great tangible link for biofuels, as we've seen within aviation or shipping or logistics, because you've got that point to point. You know exactly what is going into your plane or your ship. So therefore, for companies that are looking at sustainable aviation fuel or biofuels, that's brilliant to be talking to an airline CVC or a shipping CVC or a logistics one. For us, it's incredibly difficult because for a driver of one of our vehicles, we don't know which station they're going to. So for scope 3 emissions for us, it's quite difficult for us to put a percentage on the vehicle, on that element of the vehicle, because we simply don't know tangibly where that customer or the client who's driving our vehicles, where they're going to be filling up at a station, because it will just get absorbed between all the other forms of fuel. So we've actually passed on a number of synthetic fuels, biofuels, things like that, just for that simple reason. And I think that's a really tangible way of being able to talk to startups in those spaces, just to say, look, we're really, we talked in our pre-call about greenwashing, and that is a big fear of large corporates, because, and that's something that, we want to make sure we can tangibly link our investments back to JLR's route to net zero by 2039. However, that is a problem that, JLR is not going to solve on its own. It's a multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar problem that, we're going to have to work together, and we do actively invest alongside some of JLR's competitors, whether it's BMW or Volvo, Hyundai, Porsche. These are really good friends of ours and people that we talk to on a regular basis in their investment arms to make sure that we're working towards very similar goals.
I think that's really interesting, because you would probably think, oh, car company, they'll love a biofuel. But such as the complexity of climate, as you're saying, you can't guarantee that the driver is going to be filling it with the biofuel and not the petrol when the engine is interchangeable between the two.
Correct. And it's a very similar thing with hydrogen. And again, if we think about hydrogen at the moment and the use cases within hydrogen, very much they are point-to-point use cases. So trucking, where you've got a depot, because we've all seen the issues with with rolling out an electric charging infrastructure. If we then think about doubling that up with a hydrogen one as well, again, I think that's one that, like many OEMs, JLR has placed its bets firmly, in the battery space. And therefore that's one, again, hydrogen would not be an area that we'd be looking to invest in as part of our existing thesis for a very similar reason.
That's looking at the CVC's track record again, right? So if you're a big battery investor, you're probably not going to go big on hydrogen for transport. Not that hydrogen for transport is doing that well right now, but this is just an example. But just really quickly, so, you want founders who are really understanding the problem to be getting in touch with you and saying, look, this is what we're doing. This is why the problem is so important to JLR. And yes, I'm working on the solution. So perhaps for anybody listening to this, if you're thinking about writing that email, ask yourself, have I spoken about the problem and demonstrated that I'm an expert in the problem area? I think at the end of the day, CVC investing is still like VC investing, in that they're investing in the team and the founders as much as anything, especially at seed, and need to believe that you're the right people to carry this forward.
Absolutely. I would say that, and where we're moving away from is this view that CVC is necessarily something different to venture capital. I think it's an extension of venture capital, and that's what I don't want it to the perception that we're looking to change is that something's an either or an or, actually it's a really valuable element of the VC ecosystem, and we are supported by a parent company with access to tools, technologies, and expertise that some of our VC partners do not have. And actually, we work very closely with a lot of our lead investors. So we co-invest. We don't look to lead rounds. So working with a lead investor to say, okay, what can you bring to this? How can you work with these guys to understand how things are developing in the countries in which you operate? How are you seeing things develop? And typically at that seed and pre-seed stage, we're either the first OEM investor on the cap table or the first enterprise investor on that cap table. So we're helping in some of the go-to-market approaches for startups, because this typically would be their first, particularly at that seed stage, going to talk to a procurement, person in a large corporate is a bit of a daunting process. Now, what we've been able to help our portfolio companies with is set them up with the friendlier, if they exist in procurement, the friendly person within the procurement team who can help them, really understand what's in the head of a corporate procurement person. What are they looking for? How is this conversation going to land? How can we help you shape your business model or something like that? Now, what I would really emphasize in that is we have a very clear and thick wall between InMotion Ventures and JLR, the parent company. And we take the confidentiality of our relationships, both with the startup and with our corporate parent, incredibly seriously, because we know that if we ever were to cross that wall, nobody would ever trust us again from either side. So therefore, it's really important to us that relationships that we build with our startups as an investor in them and how we promote them are very, very different to the commercial relationships that exist with JLR, because clearly, vice versa, there's information that is confidential that we wouldn't be sharing with either party.
Got you. Why do you think it's important for large corporates like JLR to be part of the net zero transition? I think we're talking in a climate where we've perhaps seen some corporates slightly roll back on their commitments. And maybe that's just the temporary political wind, who knows? What would be your take?
So I think if I go back a number of years, and I was, particularly interested in the climate space, and actually that's one of the reasons I joined, JLR in the first place, 6 years ago, was I wanted to be part of something that was industry defining or industry changing. I had the great fortune of working at a retailer when internet shopping was not a thing, and all of a sudden someone would be walking in saying, "Oh, we sold £1,000 of cosmetics, through our online channel." And we got very excited about that. Whereas now it's kind of, 40, 50, 60% of that company's, revenue channels. So that's really what I saw within automotive, that there is a commitment, which, let's be honest, is driven a lot by regulation into, particularly in Europe, about what can and can't be sold in the future. But I think the sea change that we're seeing is that the incumbent legacy companies are no longer seen as the bad person. It used to be, when I was there, when we were talking about this at the very beginning, legacy companies were seen as the enemy. Look what they've done. This is horrendous, and therefore we need something completely different. Whereas now, what I think people have realized is that the route to net zero is a multi-billion, trillion-dollar problem, and actually it's the incumbents that have got the cash to really be part of the solution to changing that. And also, as we move, through that process, it's really important that we remember that our route to net zero is 50% technological and 50% psychological. And that was a great piece that came through from, I had a great privilege of listening to a panel that Rory Sutherland was on at, Climate Week a couple of years ago. And it really hit home that is the case, because at the moment, and we see it at the moment within the EV infrastructure, or the way that EV sales, they're growing, but they're still heavily dependent on subsidies, because consumers at the moment are not willing to sacrifice the performance or inefficient or a perceived level of let's say difficulty in owning or using something, or price. So customers are still not willing to give up. What we call it performance and price. That customers are still, or clients and consumers and people are still not willing to put up with an inferior product or a perceived inferior product or a more expensive product in the pursuit of net zero gains. They're just simply not there yet. So we've got to do a lot of work to persuade to people that, actually, typically, if I look at, in the world of batteries or even going into tire recycling, for example, typically the recycled product is of a higher quality than the virgin product. And that's something that people, don't necessarily realize and understand. But again, how we help people understand, as we go through that process, is going to be one that I think is going to take a really broad church to do. And again, some of the investments that we've made in technologies have been alongside fashion companies. If we look at Gen Phoenix, for example, a leather recycling company based in Peterborough in the UK, we invested alongside Tapestry, who have Coach as one of their brands, and Dr. Martens. We were the three strategic investors in Gen Phoenix's round. And it's, again, really important to think about how are people considering, that their buying behaviors, their habits, in terms of that route to net zero.
Okay, there's a lot of food for thought there. We've got time for one last question, which is, you've said this is the best job that you've ever had. Why?
It's a great, so yeah. Well, I have to caveat with that saying that up until 2.5 years ago, I spent 25 years in the finance function. So I suppose anything would be considered a positive thing after that. But so to be honest, the bit I really love is the variety that we have and the conversations that we're able to have. And I think that the impact that we're making already within, our parent company since we reset the thesis. So we're a group of people who are trying to make a real tangible impact on, the startups that we work with and invest in and our parent company. And we're doing that. And I get a huge amount of satisfaction from that, because I see the difference that we're making on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. I see when, just the other day, their proof of concept was approved with one of our portfolio companies with JLR, and that was just fantastic news to see how that's developing, how that relationship is developing, and you think, and again, this is something where we've gone beyond where the company was thinking, and 6 to 9 months after our investment, we were able to bring that company into a proof of concept that's now working with the parent. Now, startups and angels who are listening to this might just think, oh my God, that's such a long time. But actually, that's pretty quick. We think
it is, yeah.
In terms of what we're able to do. So one step at a time. We're making our decisions quicker. We're acting in a more VC way, and we've got to keep working on the parent to keep speeding that up.
Because I think it's easy to underestimate what you're doing, Mike. Even just the decision to stop being a finance director and go into a CVC, in large part, you said because of climate. We really, when we talk about psychology, one of the most important things that somebody can do is when they have that seniority and when they have those years of experience and they have those relationships, especially at these large corporates, and they're able to say, okay, for my next career move, I'm going to see where I can make the most difference to climate innovation. I think it's easy to underestimate that and say, yes, of course, that's a very obvious thing to do, but it's actually not. And I think it's very brave to stick your head above the parapet for anybody with an established career to then say, right, I'm going to actually do something quite new, which may or may not succeed, because I believe it might help the climate. And at the end of the day, the climate emergency is not going away. So I actually think that is and it's important to represent that journey, Mike, to show other people that this could be one of the most impactful things that they do with their whole career.
Well, that's a lovely thing for you to say. So, and thank you. But also, I feel as though I'm in very warm safe company. So if I think about, what you tend to see more recently is that a lot of the CVC heads, so doing my role, tend to come from the parent company, whilst our investment team, our principals, our associates come from a VC background. Actually, the people leading the CVCs tend to be now more inside people because they are able to make those connections back into the parent company. And as a former member of JLR's finance leadership team, I believe I have a level of credibility across the business, because one of the most amazing things about a finance career like a CVC is it can be completely, different. You can move from one role to another and it's completely different. And you touch a large part of the organization in a very credible way. And that's what I believe, if I look back and, what I believe I've helped the team do over the last 2.5 years, I think it's making those connections in a really credible way. But at the same time, you've got to have, I can, knock those doors, but those doors have still got to be unlocked and opened. And I think I am very, lucky in the sense that I work with a very, enlightened group of people in JLR who are, working incredibly hard and are making big changes every day, to deliver on that commitment that we've made.
Okay. Well, we're about at time, Mike. So I think when we look back on this episode of Climate Takes, I think it's going to take technology and psychology, consumer behavior. It's going to take people choosing where to apply their experience. It's going to take understanding the varied world of CVCs and understanding how to engage, when to engage, and when to step away. And I think climate's going to take corporate VCs. Thank you very much for joining me, Mike.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Sarah.
You're very welcome. And then just for everybody listening, you're very welcome to subscribe for upcoming episodes of Climate Takes. And actually, at the moment, applications for our programs are open, our Venture Builder and our Accelerator. So if you are a founder who's working in climate, and particularly if you think that maybe one day you want to have an investable venture which could work with the likes of JLR, well, Carbon 13 is a great place to start that journey. Thank you very much.